Hello and welcome to the State of Data Security, the Human Impact of Cybercrime. Today's webinar is sponsored by Rubrik and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this discussion panel. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, there's the questions box in your webinar control panel. A lot of you have been saying hello in there. We appreciate that. It's good to see where everyone is logging in from. The Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh will fix most audio, video, or slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know there in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Additionally, we won't have a live Q&A portion of this webcast, but if you do have any questions for the panel members, just drop those in the Q&A there and we'll be sure they see them during or after the presentation. Now, second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. There's one handout I'd really like to call your attention to. It's the report that this conversation is built on. In fact, I'd recommend downloading it right now so you can follow along with some of the stats and data that our panel will be discussing. It's an engaging but deep report on the state of data security from Rubrik Zero Labs. You'll also find some other great resources in the handouts like Actual Tech Media's Guerrilla Guide Book Club, our upcoming events calendar, and the ATM Decisions Group. Now, third, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Now, of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. And with that, let's get to today's timely discussion. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters today. We have Stephen Stone, who's head of the Rubrik Zero Labs that developed this report. We have Michael Mestrovich, CIO from Rubrik, and we have Jason Schultz, who's Chief Innovation and Technology Officer for Michael Best and Friedrich LLP, a national full-service firm for legal services and business consulting. So I am going to turn things over to Stephen now.
So everyone on the call, thank you for joining. We're really excited for this next Rubrik Zero Labs report. Just as a quick refresher, our first Rubrik Zero Labs report, which came out in the fall, focused on the human impact from cybercrime. This one that we're releasing at this time is going to focus on the hard truths around data security. And I'll speak a little bit more about what that is here in a minute. First, I'd like to say just a big thanks to Jason and Mike, two great senior leaders in this industry, and really excited to have a conversation about what we found in this report and stress testing our findings with these two leaders. Little admin before we dive into the details of the report. First of all, this report's going to cover calendar year 2022. So the 1st of January through the 31st of December 2022. We've got a wide range of data sets. One of the things I'm most excited for in this report is that we have 3 distinct data sets. First, we use Rubrik telemetry to really go after data at scale. In essence, we wanted to use our own organic telemetry to talk about things that we can ask the machines to answer and get machine answers back that give us accuracy and idea of scope and scale of data. The second data set we used was we partnered with Wakefield Research and engaged over 1,600 senior cybersecurity leaders to really focus on the people problems. We figured it was best to ask the machines machine problems and people, the people challenges. Those 1,600 cybersecurity leaders really break into 2 different groups. We intentionally focused on both IT leaders and security leaders. We found that those 2 entities often have to work together and have different challenges and similar challenges at the same time. So we thought that that was really important. Of those 1,600 leaders, over half of them, over 800, were at the CIO and CISO position. The others were at the VP or senior director position. And the third data set we used was we engaged 4 different cybersecurity organizations. We assess our key leaders in different aspects of the cybersecurity threat landscape. Those are Mandiant, Palo Alto Unit 42, Permiso, and Expel. And we really wanted to use some of their existing data points that we believe they're best in the industry at to help round out and be as objective as possible in how we look at this data security topic. Some other things that are different in this report, this will be the first time at Rubrik's level that we're going to be able to provide regional information for those who are inside of the report site. You can choose whether you want to look at global, Americas, EMEA, or APAC metrics, and those will actually change dynamically in the site. The other piece that I would say for this project was we really designed it to do 3 distinct things. The first, we wanted to really provide concrete touch points across what I think is a fair assessment to say is a vague topic in data security. Data security can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, so we really wanted to get after some concrete touch points. Second, we wanted to provide clarity into some of the top challenges that decision makers face in this space, and that's really why we wanted to really spend time discussing this with Mike and Jason here on this call. And third, we wanted to combine both a single intrusion event, which we took from a distinct Rubrik client that went through a ransomware intrusion, and provide visibility into that case study. But we also wanted to pair that case study with what we see as large-scale takeaways from the data security landscape. So in this report, you'll see that we go through a piece of the intrusion lifecycle, take a step back, give the larger data security view, then go back into the intrusion and continue that through. We think that will really help us understand some distinct takeaways from 2022 and some strong ways that we can go forward into 2023. With all that in mind, I'm just really excited to jump into this with Mike and Jason, who are exactly the kind of senior cybersecurity leaders that we wanted to focus on and also engage with. So I'm just going to jump right into it. One of my favorite aspects of this report is likely a pretty mundane topic to a lot of people, which is data growth. This is a topic we see a lot in academic circles, but we don't have a lot of granular touch points inside of the cybersecurity industry. What we really heard from a lot of leaders was the concept of data is viewed almost as flat or static. So we went and measured that. We tested that assumption. Across 2022 and every Rubrik client, we saw an average growth of 25% in 2022, meaning that where an organization started in the beginning of the year and where they ended that year, their data grew by 25%. We measured that both across on-premises, on cloud environments, and then in SaaS apps. And that's what probably we saw the most interesting breakaway. There were some really distinct growth differences. On-premises data grew about 19% last year. Cloud, that was at 61%. And the most stark growth we saw was in SaaS, which grew at 236% in 1 year. At this rate, we would predict an organization's data will triple within 5 years. So with that perspective in mind, I'd really like to hear from 2 seasoned cybersecurity leaders. How do you effectively plan for that kind of growth? What are the factors that you think through and how you might prioritize that? Mike, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to kind of ask you that question first.
Sure, thanks, Steve. Like a lot of things, I think it's important that you're able to relate from a cybersecurity perspective into terms that the business can understand. And this is one of those areas where I think the things have been out of sync for a while. So, you know, when you look at business growth, you oftentimes look at the number of customers that you have. You look at revenue growth. You look at the number of employees. But clearly, as the data points out in your study, the data growth far exceeds what we would normally consider to be measures of organizational growth. And so what I found helpful is that you relate that with the finance team, most notably, to help them understand that those aren't the simple factors that they oftentimes look at, aren't the true measures of an organization's growth. Our cloud spend needs to be factored into that. The number of SaaS applications that are being integrated into the environment needs to factor into that. Because you're going to have to secure the data that resides in all of those various different areas. Now, I'd also contend that you need to be able to rationalize the spend that you have on the data security. Not all data is equally critical to any organization. Data certainly has a lifetime and a longevity. And so the sensitivity of the data is going to be significantly different across those various different platforms and data sets. And so you have to be able to apply some logic and assumptions to the problem. Otherwise, you're right. As the study shows, your data growth is going to be significantly greater than your organization's growth, and you're not going to have the ability and the resources to keep up with it. So additionally, as you mentioned, you know, data sharing amongst third party, amongst business suppliers, amongst partners, et cetera, that all factors into the equation. But I think, as I noted at the beginning, the overarching concern is that you'll be able to relay data growth as a measure of organizational growth, and you're able to relay that in concrete business terms to the finance team.
Jason, I'd love to hear from you on the same question, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I think data proliferation is a real challenge. It's been driven by a variety of factors. Certainly, our increased use of digital devices, the expanded use of the Internet of Things, and a lot of the development's been happening in that space, and then just the widespread adoption of online media platforms. I was reading a report last week that suggested by I think it was 2025, there'll be over 35 billion smart devices collecting, analyzing, and sharing data. And also by 2025, it's expected that 70% of all tech spending is going to go toward cloud solutions. So I would agree with you, Steve. It is a living, breathing thing. There's a vast amount of data that's being produced and stored every day. It's diverse, it's unstructured, and oftentimes it's difficult to analyze. So I think that's created both opportunities and challenges for organizations. There's a lot of foundational technologies that have evolved, computing power, storage, backup solutions. I think those have improved exponentially. So scaling, I don't think is difficult. I think it's more about, what are we trying to scale, to Mike's point. I think the challenge is growing useful data and being able to classify and categorize that data correctly. If you don't understand the data you have, you cannot plan strategically to grow that data and ultimately secure it. And so I think data growth is inevitable. I think data bloat is likely far more common.
Yeah, listening to both your answers, which I just completely agree with. I hate to start off a discussion in complete agreement. That doesn't make for the best dialogue, but I think it's really correct. And one thing if I'm hearing both of you correctly, is prioritization, and that ultimately leads to trade-offs. That's the whole reason we prioritize. So if we think about data in that way, and it's not all created equal, one thing that we looked at in this report, and I'd love to pick your brain on, Jason, is sensitive data. So just for an idea of scale, if we looked at all the secure data that Rubrik had access to in 2022, we saw that 1 of every 38 files contained sensitive data. And then if we flipped it a little bit and looked at a typical organization, so really kind of measuring what you can most expect, a typical organization is going to have over 500,000 files that contain sensitive data, and a total of just under 25 million sensitive data records. What became really interesting was we took those numbers and we compared it to all the financial penalties, which I know are not the best way to measure impact, but they're a tangible way. So we compared it to GDPR, HIPAA, CPPA, CPRA, and go down the whole list. And what we found was that typical organizations' amount of sensitive data would max out any financial penalty if it became compromised in totality. Jason, I know this is a topic near and dear to your heart. You work in and with industries that care greatly about sensitive data. I could pick your brain all day on this, but I'd like to kind of limit it to just a few questions. I don't overwhelm the audience. But first question I would ask is, do these numbers surprise you? Is this something that you think organizations do well? And then really the big takeaway, how should we think about this for the upcoming year?
Yeah, I think the numbers aren't surprising, but I think sensitive data is a broad term that has slightly different definitions depending on what organization you're talking to. I know the primary reason professional service organizations like our firm are often the victim of cyber attacks is because the amount of sensitive data, the amount of valuable data that we have because of the fact that we are essentially keeping that for multiple entities, multiple companies. So as a result, cybersecurity has definitely become one of the top challenges for professional service organizations like the firm I work for. I think many organizations are not aware of the amount and the type of data that they've been gathering and where it's stored. And I think because they lack visibility into where the data is and how it functions in their business, they're burdened. They're burdened with accountability without control. And so I think looking forward, I think IT leaders really must develop a deep understanding of their data, who has access to it, where it resides, and then the classification of it, as I mentioned in the earlier exchange.
Yeah, your discussion around process and how we do that really raised something else that we ran into when we really started this project around the hard truths of data security. And I mentioned it earlier as well, that there's a real opaque nature to what that even means. And that definitely applies into how you do data security. And not surprisingly, we found a real lack of consistency around what you just mentioned, Jason, the implementation of data security and how you go after those things. We took some fairly straightforward, well-accepted things that are viewed as core to data security, zero trust initiative, defining orchestrated ways to recover data, testing backup recovery, and having an incident response plan. These are mentioned by almost every organization in the space. And we asked these 1,600 IT and security leaders, how many of these does your organization do? And what we found out is for each of those, it was about half, about somewhere between 52 to 56% of organizations do any one of these single items. So Mike, if I could kind of put you on the hot seat a little bit, what would you recommend these organizations focus on as they look at data security? And what do you think is keeping us from a faster adoption on these topics we all agree are important?
Yeah, I think in the past when we talked about things like business continuity or disaster recovery, we focused on what are the critical applications that an organization has. And I think what people are now realizing is that it's not just the critical applications, but it's the critical data that an organization has. And data does not equate to applications. What I mean by that is applications may be the source for lots of data, but you'll soon start to discover if you kind of start mapping your data that it moves throughout your environment, that it lives, it has a lifespan of its own, it has a period of relevance. And people use and consume that data in order to conduct business functions in ways that you might not have imagined. And so when you talk about establishing rules and parameters for business continuity and disaster recovery and conduct of business operations, you really need to understand not only the applications that are the source of the data, but how people actually use the data and how it migrates throughout your environment. If you can do these things, if you can map these things out well, if you have a good idea of how these things operate within your environment, then you can effectively apply the resources to protect it, and then you can also apply the procedures to protect it as well and practice those types of things. You need to understand the access rules. You need to understand as well, what are the access cadences? How do people access the data? How do they use that data? Is that different potentially on a Monday or a Friday or at the beginning of a quarter or at the end of the quarter? But if you can understand what the norm in your environment looks like, then you can begin to understand what's abnormal and you can work then for ways to protect it.
I really appreciate that. That's great, Mike. Jason, if I'm reading the room right, it looks like there's a few points you'd like to make there as well on this topic.
Yeah, it's a big question, right? There's a lot to unpack there, but I think at the end of the day, security is not just a technological problem. It's a people, process, and knowledge problem, and there's a lot of challenges I think that we're facing just with overall adoption rates. Certainly, the volume of attacks is up. I was reading a report. I think it was the FBI's annual crime report they published, and they stated that cybercrime has skyrocketed by 300% since the start of COVID in 2020. So I think that has resulted in a lot of human burnout. There's also the volume of just technology advancements that make it very hard to prioritize what to buy for what need. There's a lot of noise that we're trying to cut through in the security space. I think companies are getting very good at one thing. They go public, they expand, they acquire, and then they start selling a product that may take a dip for a bit. And so the most challenging part, I think, for a lot of cybersecurity professionals is the landscape itself, the tools, the overlap, and the fact that there's just a lot of noise that folks have to cut through. It's almost become an art and a science where you have to properly understand the capabilities, but also be able to stitch those products together, ultimately to drive the business. I think we're dealing with a lot of volatility as it relates to the overall threat landscape, and this has definitely strained operations. There's also challenges with talent. I know we are certainly challenged when we go to the market and try to find folks that have this level of expertise. And so just getting the right folks in the right seats to help out is another concern. And then just the variety. We've been talking about different attack vectors. I think the advent of generative AI is going to make it much easier for bad actors to launch very sophisticated attacks. And so that opens up a whole nother list of questions and concerns as it relates to how we continue to combat the changing landscapes. I can tell you from a prioritization perspective, I think organizations need to really be thinking about this from a top-down perspective. I know at our firm, our security directives are being driven from the top. It's not just me, it's the entire senior leadership team that's on board to make sure that we're getting the right amount of risk management in place for our organization. I also think that's because recovery from an event isn't just a technical exercise, as both of you have alluded to. There's costs that include attorney fees, litigation, there's improvements to your cybersecurity program, customer relationships, damage to the reputation, and so on. So I think it really involves a team effort to make sure that you're prioritizing the right activities. And then I think to Mike's point, it's really not a question of if, but when. And so you have to be battle ready. You have to make sure that you have proper controls in place, but not that they're just in place, that you're actually testing them and making sure that your documented policies and incident response plans are actually ready and able to work when you need them.
Well, Jason, you mentioned one of my own personal favorite parts of this career is I've always been on the threat side, and I've always really enjoyed looking at the intrusions and helping organizations by looking from the perspective of the attackers. And one of the things I really personally enjoyed in this report was we were able to map, an actual event that we present in a case study to the larger data security landscape. And I think there's really two things that jumped out based on that attack perspective. And the first one of those is, ransomware deployment happens in the middle of the intrusion. It's often discussed like attackers get in and deploy ransomware and then it gets started. And what we're really seeing, I think the case study lays out pretty well, is the ransomware event's in the middle. It's not the beginning and it's definitely not the end. And again, when we worked with these other cybersecurity organizations to give that larger perspective, we saw very similar feedback items both from Mandiant and Expel. Mandiant has talked about dwell time is what they call it. How long is an attacker in an environment before they're detected? And they're noting in their 2023 report that the global median dwell time for ransomware was 9 days, basically meaning the attackers are in the environment for 9 days before they're detected, often by deploying the ransomware. And then Expel noted that 97% of ransomware attempts that their security operations center dealt with, they were able to stop prior to ransomware deployment. And if we look at the case study we have, we see a very similar trend. The attackers were in the environment for 5 days before they deployed ransomware. So with that in mind, a question I would have for both of you is, when you think of ransomware actors and their activities, what do you think about before the encryption event? And are there lessons we can take away for non-ransomware activities and apply to the larger threat landscape? Jason, I'll kind of kick that over to you first.
Yeah, I'd like to use a quote from the report. I think it was by Chris Krebs, and he said, "One of the most effective techniques I've seen to prepare for these types of attacks is to accept you're going to have a bad day at some point, and your job is to ensure that it doesn't become a worse day." And so I think that's often what we're looking at. We're thinking about it in terms of probability. What is the probability of the event happening? What's the probability we can recover within a recovery point or recovery time objectives? And what's the probability that we can continue operations securely after we recover? To be clear, we would prefer not to have any unauthorized users in our environment, but if they get in, we want to stop them before they can really do any damage. And I think to the other point that you made, or the other question, there's always lessons to be learned from every event, big or small. So we're big believers in conducting retrospective exercises or after action reviews to kind of go through the incident and determine what we could keep doing, what we should start doing, what we should stop doing. Certainly there's a lot of questions around how did they get in? How did they remain undetected? What privileges did they have? And how do we prevent it from happening again? And so I really believe that a multi-layered defense strategy of prevention, deterrence, and detection is essential. And so that's certainly something that we talk about and focus on at our firm.
Now, Mike, I'll ask you the same question. I think I know what you're going to say. We've talked about this a lot, you and I, and here at Rubrik. So I'd be curious on your thoughts on the same question.
Yeah, Steve, from my perspective, as the report noted, the cyber actors are in for a duration before any type of ransomware activity occurs. So what I often think about is, they're doing at least 2 or 3 things, assuming that they're competent cyber actors. Number one is they're trying to assess the IT architecture that you have and understanding where the weak points are. And the weak point that they exploit during this particular cyber event may not be the weak point that they exploit in the next one. They want to come back. And so they also want to understand what assets that you actually have and what data that you have would be of most value to them. And then, like I said before, they're trying to establish persistence if they can. And so where could they implant backdoors, or where could they compromise other parts of your architecture on the next go around? So my concern is always, the reconnaissance events that these actors are going through before they make you well aware of your presence in the environment. So from my perspective, not only is it about, removing the ransomware, recovering business operations, but it's also about ensuring that we've fully evicted any cyber actor from the environment, that we've gone through the time for the forensic analysis to understand, where they came in, limited the blast radius, understand from the logs and all of the forensic details that we can collect what they actually did while they were in the environment, in an effort to make sure that all the back doors are closed, that we've eradicated any type of malware that they may have put in place, and that we've fully evicted them and that we've fully cleaned the environment.
Yeah, I love everything both of you said. I think we're very much in lockstep there. So I'm going to try to mix up a little bit, and maybe throw out a topic we may not be as much agreement over. The second aspect I saw that really jumped out as we looked at the case study compared to the larger perspective is there was quite a bit of good news in here. And I think that was a little surprising because so much of cybersecurity, we focus on the bad, the intrusions, the things we didn't see coming, the bad days. We spend a lot of our time there, rightfully so. But as we worked through this, we really saw clearly organizations are improving their ability to fight through these events. In the case study, as a perfect example, the victim organization was prepared for data recovery operations. They were fairly well prepared for a ransomware encryption event. They found novel ways to use data backup options for both forensics and governance actions, which isn't a thing we talk about typically. And they also were able to make rapid decisions based on an informed view of their data. This gave me personally a lot of optimism. So Jason, am I being naive here? In your work across your own organization, your own clients, are you also seeing some of these good news stories?
Sure, I think there's definitely positive signs. I think it's challenging, right, predicting the future. I think most IT leaders fail to realize how quickly some of the technology advancements are increasing and what capability comes along with that, good and bad. I still feel cyber protection is always probably a step or two behind the cyber attacks themselves, because we're always trying to learn to get better. But certainly there are definitely positive signs. In fact, earlier this week, I read of the report, the FBI, along with, I think it was 16 other countries, brought down the Genesis market, which is that Russian-linked online marketplace that were shopping and selling stolen credentials. So I think that brought a smile to a lot of people's faces in the industry, that there is good news that you can go out and query as it relates to cybersecurity. I do believe that the industry as a whole is trending in the right direction. I think a lot of the conversations that I've been a part of are becoming more security focused. Folks are getting savvier as it relates to some of the topics and some of the controls. And overall, I think managing risk has now become a market differentiator, and certainly a tool that you can use to sell and bolster your brand in the industry.
Yeah, I think that's all really profound and really matches what we're seeing as well. So I'm going to kind of keep the good news theme rolling just at least a little bit longer and enjoy it while we can. One of the other things we saw moving away from the intrusion situation is, Rubrik Zero Labs noticed a 16% improvement in overall data security posture based on our Rubrik telemetry for 2022. Without getting too deep into the weeds here on this call, in essence, we do a technical evaluation of an environment based on 4 factors: platform security, data protection, ransomware evaluation, and sensitive data discovery. I know these are not everything, but it gave us a really defined quantitative and qualitative touch point on a 16% improvement in the course of 1 year. When I think about that from a senior leader perspective, Mike, I'd be curious, what do you see as the biggest levers CISOs in particular can pull and make these types of improvements? And how do we keep that going? How do we keep this going year over year?
Well, Steve, I think the role of the CISO today is becoming ever more important, and I think that you're seeing this in a lot of different ways. Jason mentioned this as well. There continues to be a lot of effort from governmental organizations to further emphasis on cybersecurity. The Biden administration recently released an updated cybersecurity strategy, and right there in pillar number 3, it talks about helping to have enhanced cybersecurity in all of our software products from the OEMs, and using regulatory means to go ahead and further that. So I say that because boards of organizations are now becoming much more cyber savvy. And so I guess that's the long way of saying, the boards themselves and the ways that organizations run themselves are much more attuned to the cyber landscape. I think that's made the CISO's job, if I could dare say this, a little bit easier because the audience there is much more understanding of the roles and responsibilities of cyber within their own organization. There's going to be more intense reporting requirements from cyber regulators along the way. I think boards are looking for regular cyber reports from the CISO, and so I think that there's just a general heightened interest in cybersecurity. As was mentioned earlier by Jason, cyber events can have a harm to brand and to reputation, and they can certainly affect the trajectory of an organization. And I just think that the business landscape itself is much more attuned of the effects of cybersecurity and cyber events going forward. And so it's a much more receptive audience. Now, as I said before, the CISO still needs to do their work in helping to build the cyber program and justify the investments in terms that the business can relate to. But at the outset, I would contend that they've got a much more receptive audience than I think that they've had in the past.
Yeah, I think we see a lot of those things across a lot of places. And I think we'll probably need to shift off the good news topics. We're kind of playing with fire if we focus on good news too much in our business. But one thing I'll go back to that came through in the case study in the report that I've seen as long as I've been in this industry is illicit valid credentials. In the case study, we talk about how the attacker was able to gain access to and effectively leverage these illicit valid credentials. When I say this isn't new, I won't speak for either one of you, but as long as I've been working intrusions, I've seen this. I literally cannot think of a single intrusion where I have not seen valid access be a core part of the intrusion. And again, we wanted to be as objective as possible. And so we talked with Permiso in particular, who focuses on cloud incident response. And one of the data points they allowed us to bring into the report was in 2022, 100% of the cloud intrusions they worked had valid credential use by bad actors. And also these exact same credentials were 90% overprivileged, which effectively just means the credential did not use 90% of the permission that it had, which creates a lot of risk surface area, especially knowing that this is part of, in their numbers, 100%. And that matches, my own experience. Jason, you work in fields where identity and personal details are absolutely critical, even without intrusions. What are some ways that you think we can balance the operational need with the reality of these threat actors just being addicted to valid credentials?
Yeah, and from my perspective, credential hacking, it's probably the number one way a threat actor can compromise a system. So once they're in, the only way they can do things that are harmful to your environment is to act with an identity. And so I think zero trust principles are a strong place to start. These frameworks require users, whether they're in or outside the organization, to be authenticated, authorized, and continuously validated. And I think that puts the organization in a better posture to make sure that they're granting access to the right individuals and that access is being applied when needed. We've also talked a little bit about some of the just-in-time privilege capabilities to make it easier to give people access without giving it to them all the time. And so this is an area where we're trying to continuously get better, extending our capabilities with single sign-on, extending our mobile device management program, and just really trying to rope in other assets that are outside of our physical control to make sure that we can contain it on some level.
Yep, I absolutely agree. I think that really speaks to a lot of the ways that we can go at this and still be effective in how we run our business. And I know we're running close on time. I really appreciate the time both of you have spent on this, so I don't want to take any more of that. But I'd like to ask one more question, and it revolves around, we've talked a lot about business and finance and legal and HR, lots of non-IT, non-security things. And all three of us have mentioned in just this conversation about the need to convert findings and takeaways to these other audiences and partners. So I'd like to kind of shape the last question around that, which is a skill set, at least in my experience, I've had to learn the hard way, which is storytelling. We often have had to learn as experts that come up through the ranks, you can't just throw numbers and data out. It just doesn't work. You have to give context and direction and guidance. And one of the things we talked about in this report was trying to nest some of these data points together to do that. And we talk about, as an example, from Rubrik secured data in 2022, only 0.004% of that secured data encountered an encryption event. That number by itself doesn't mean much, but when we tie it to everything inside of that very small number was tied to a lack of MFA. 100% of that 0.004% was because of no MFA enablement. Again, that 0.004% maps to almost half of our client set being targeted by some aspect of ransomware precursor activity, and really having to show how do you go from half of the client set tackling a problem to it only affecting 0.004% of that. And then also, how do you tie that into the larger world of data breaches, malicious insider, business outages, all these other things. So the last question I'd like to really ask both of you is, I'm sure there's a topic you've had to learn and grow with, and in your experience as a senior cybersecurity leader, how do you work to create the right story and drive the right decisions? So Mike, I'll kind of put it to you first.
Sure. I think as a starting point, the cyber program has to be in ruthless alignment with the business objectives of the larger organization, and you have to be able to show how past investments of cyber have actually helped enhance business capabilities. This isn't as you've noted. This is not easy. It's actually quite hard. You have to be able to show organizations how cyber investments can change the risk to the organization, whether that be risks to intellectual property theft, risks to future sales, risks to the company's good name. But you got to be able to put things in some type of quantitative risk and then show how enhanced capabilities and investments in those capabilities can go drive down that risk. But as you noted, this is more of an art. It's a storytelling than it is a science. But you got to be able to do that, and I think cyber professionals that are able to do that well and are able to show that story and how that translates into results that the business understands, I think those are the ones that have outside success.
And Jason, how about you? How has this worked on your end?
Yeah, storytelling, what an important skill set to develop and enhance over time. I think we all encounter unexpected changes, and oftentimes our responses are determined by how we perceive and understand those changes. And so this is why storytelling is so important. For me, it always starts with creating a sense of urgency. So defining how security helps deliver business valued outcomes, to Mike's point, tying it back to the organization. I also like to help educate folks on the consequences of remaining in our current state. And unfortunately, there's a lot of lessons to be learned by mistakes other companies are making. So the headlines typically provide some ammunition to convey that story. And then we try to bring it down to the numbers. So what's the likelihood and what's the impact of a security event in our industry for our firm, and what's the cost of being down? So really tying it back to the numbers. From there, I think it's important to create a vision for change. What is the desired future state that you're working toward, and what are those business valued outcomes that you're going to achieve when you get there? And then the third thing I found very helpful is really developing a coalition. As a senior technology leader, I think there's a lot of expectations to be both a firefighter and a forecaster. And I know that you can't do it alone. So tending to both the present and the future, I think, requires a team, and you have to keep the process running. So that team is certainly comprised of folks inside of our organization. We have Security Council and Innovation Council. We even have our own cybersecurity practice group, but it's also the external partnerships, the third-party partners that provide credibility and validation. And certainly that's one of the reasons why our firm decided to work with Rubrik. We are tied to your mission of securing data. We are tied to your mission of making sure that we don't pay a ransom, and you guys have a track record of doing that. And so I think once you partner up with organizations like Rubrik, that's additional ammunition, that's additional content that can be added to your story to really make sure people are aware of what's going on in the space. At the end of the day, I'm a big believer that security should strengthen your brand. Your security should provide your clients with peace of mind. Your security should protect the productivity gains of all the digital transformation initiatives that organizations are going after, and should be something that's a value add to your clientele.
Well, gentlemen, I could ask both of you your thoughts all day long, but I'm sure both of you have organizations to defend and secure, so I'll try to let you get back to it. I'd like to thank you both for your time. This has been a great conversation on my end. I've learned something, as I always do, talking with both of you. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you for any closing details.
Well, thanks, Stephen, Michael, and Jason for that really interesting discussion around the results of the report on the state of data security, and for some great advice on keeping secure. Really appreciate your time today. And again, that report from Rubrik Zero Labs is a great resource. It's available in your handouts. Now, before we wrap up, let's do our Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the $250 Amazon gift card today is Brian Foster from California. So congratulations to Brian. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Rubrik for making this event possible. And thanks to all of you for attending. That concludes today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day.